Hey everyone! Today I'm building a 1/6 scale Gothic church interior with a vaulted ceiling. The structure is built from dollar store foamboard and paper. It's not a grand cathedral, but a small private chapel for a vampire bride. This is a follow-up to my previous build, but in this video the focus is purely on the architecture. Before I cut anything, I needed to lay out the space. Gothic interiors are built from repeating bays, so everything starts here. These foamboard pieces are the ceiling bases. The shorter one becomes a termination, and the longer one turns into the corridor leading into it. Right now it looks completely flat, but this part controls how the whole space will feel later. I mark the base directly onto the foamboard. The pencil lines are hard to see on camera, so I'll overlay them digitally here. All the bays have the same depth, only the width changes as they move toward the termination. That small change is doing something important. It quietly stretches the space without adding a single inch. Once the bays are set, I draw the arch lines that define the vault. I don't have a compass big enough, so I'm using a piece of thread to find the curves. These lines don't look like much now, but they carry the entire ceiling. Now comes the cutting. This part alone went through more blades than the rest of the build combined. Nothing fancy here, just careful cuts and a lot of patience. You can see the bays are trapezoidal now. In real Gothic churches, bays are usually close to square, but this isn't a real church, it's a diorama for the camera. I'm using forced perspective to make the space feel deeper on screen. You might wonder why I don't also shrink the bay depth. And yes, that would make sense if this were meant to be seen from outside, but because the camera lives inside the space, the termination base stays full scale, the corridor does most of the illusion work. Next, I built the termination bay walls. There are 5 walls total and 3 of them will have windows. I double the depth of each window opening so they feel carved into stone instead of punched through foam. Then I add thin cardstock strips around the edges to hide the raw foam board. It's a tiny step, but this is where the windows stop looking like craft material and start looking architectural. Now for the termination base ceiling. I start by marking fanning lines on the foam board. These guide where the arches will attach, just like in the previous section. The center point sits about 2/3 into the depth of the bay. After that, I repeat the same vault building process used in the corridor. Now I'm making the vault panels, also called webbing. Instead of explaining this step in detail, I'll let you watch. This part looks simple and then quietly eats your soul. It feels like making a sewing pattern but with cardstock that refuses to cooperate. The cardstock is fairly stiff, so smooth curves take time. Now for the Termination Bay webbing. I tried shaping cardstock directly, but it was too stiff for this geometry. So instead, I used thin rice paper to capture the shape first, then transfer that pattern onto cardstock. After folding along the curve, the panel starts to develop a real three-dimensional curve. I make a second piece and glue the two together to form a single webbing section. This is also where I learned the hard way that fast glue is a bad idea. It sets too quickly and creates uneven seams. My first prototype actually failed because of that. Overall, the Termination Bay webbing was much harder than the corridor. In the corridor, the top of the vault arches stays level with the ceiling, so the center seam of the webbing stays straight. Here, the center line bends sharply toward the wall, which makes everything more finicky. Even though this shape clearly shows the decorative vault line at the front, I'd recommend keeping the arch peak at the ceiling height like in the corridor. It's much easier. Next, I cover the webbing seams using thin strips of rice paper and wood glue. Rice paper is perfect here. It's flexible, follows curves easily, and softens joints without adding bulk. Once the seams are done, I add ribs to the ceiling. I use only transverse ribs, no diagonals. I want the ceiling to feel structured without becoming overly decorative. Each rib is made from cardstock. I score a center line so it bends cleanly, lock the fold with hot glue, and attach it using wood glue. I use 2 layers per rib just to give them a bit more presence. Finally, I brush on a light coat of varnish to blend the rice paper into surrounding surface where ribs aren't attached. I repeat the same process in the Termination Bay. Now I'm closing in the Termination Bay by adding the wall. Along the vault edge above the windows, I added thin cardstock band. Rice paper alone didn't give me enough control here. This strip sharpens the vault line and makes the ceiling feel intentionally finished instead of softly dissolving into the wall. Next, I add the response at each corner of the termination bay. They project slightly less than the vault ribs, so the ribs remain visually dominant. With the boss placed at the center of the fanning ribs, the termination base structure is complete. Now for the corridor pilasters. I've already cut the foamboard pieces, so I'll start by assembling them. In Gothic architecture, pilasters visually carry the weight of the vault down to the ground, even when they aren't structurally necessary. They pull the eye vertically, which is very much a Gothic obsession. I add a small plinth at the bottom, then a capital at the top. To keep the shafts from looking flat, I add recessed panels using thin cardstock strips. The tiny bit of depth makes a big difference even at this scale. At the top, I add narrow cardstock bands. These hide the raw connection where the pilaster meets the vault and help the transition feel cleaner. Now we need an altar and the reredos. I start with the steps, then build the mensa, the main altar block. On its own, the altar is very simple. It's meant to sit quietly in the space, not compete with the architecture around it. Behind it comes the reredos. Think of the reredos as a vertical stop, a surface that catches your eye and tells the space where to end. Without it, the altar just floats. With it, the termination base suddenly feels anchored. Right now, this looks very flat and graphic. That's normal. I'm building it from layered cardstock using shallow relief instead of deep carving. But once it's painted, those layers will read as shadow and depth rather than flat shapes. In real churches, reredos are often tall and elaborate. Here I keep it restrained. The architecture is still the main character, the reredos just helps frame the moment. I add a bit more height at the end because I felt like it was a bit too small for this space. Now for the floor. I draw the grid, then press the lines gently with a pencil to keep the texture subtle. The base color is a warm white. I finish with a light brown wash to unify everything. It's slightly giving public restroom floor right now, but once the architecture is in, it settles down, I promise. Now that everything is built, we can finally start painting. Before any color goes on, every surface needs gesso. The layer has to stay thin, so I'm using a very small brush. I honestly underestimated this part. Too much gesso adds texture, too little doesn't seal the paper. Covering the entire church with a tiny brush in thin layers while making sure everything was properly sealed wasn't easy at all. And here's the funny part. Most of this is already white, so it's really hard to tell where I've already painted. After 2 thin coats, it's finally ready. I'm aiming for a stone surface. Paint consistency matters a lot here. I mix it to a milk-like consistency, not watery, not thick. I don't want chalky surfaces. Stone should feel dense, quiet, and slightly translucent. I applied 2 thin layers of blue, letting each one dry completely. There are advantages to painting after assembly, but I can safely say I'm not doing it this way again. The ribs are painted a reddish brown. They're meant to read as red in context, not on their own. For the walls, I just warmed the tone slightly. If you can barely see the difference, that's perfect. The final step is shadow. This isn't weathering, it's about revealing form. I darken edges, corners, and recessed areas very selectively. Now it's time to connect the corridor and the termination. Something felt off. The termination looked too shallow. Fixing this part took a lot of thinking. After trying a few ideas, I decided to add a transition between the two spaces. Originally, the vaults were meant to land directly on the deepest corridor pilasters, so that connection had to be carefully resolved. In the end, I added three things. First, wristbands to receive the vault. Second, a transverse arch at the end of the corridor. Third, 6 inches of wall between the two spaces. It's a small change, but it will give the termination bay room to breathe and make the procession feel intentional. There's only one step left, the windows. They're made from rice paper and cardstock. The process itself is simple, so I'll let you watch. The wrinkles are intentional. They soften the light, break perfection, and make the windows feel human.